Okay, so you've been reading all the headlines and maybe skimmed a few of those long reports, and you're thinking, man, I really just want to get to the bottom of this.
Right.
So that's what we're doing today. We're going to break down this Digital Frontier newsletter from April 7th, 2025, and kind of give you the need to know on the macro landscape and what it could mean for Bitcoin.
Yeah, you want to understand what these experts are really saying about the markets and why it matters. And so we're going to dig into their Z-score framework and kind of like their overall economic outlook.
All right, so let's jump right into it with the Z-score thing.
Okay.
So they've got two numbers here, a negative 0.46 for the short term and then a plus 0.98 for the long term.
Right.
So what's the initial takeaway from that?
So the negative short-term score, the negative 0.46, that's basically them waving yellow flag. They're saying, hey, things are pretty volatile right now.
Mm-hmm.
We think there are some big risks of a global recession coming up soon, so be careful. But
Yeah. And then what about the long term? Because that's a whole different story with that plus 0.98.
yeah, totally different story. That positive long-term score,
Mhm.
it shows that they see some really strong global liquidity out there, and they think that central banks are going to eventually start easing up on monetary policy. And their thesis is that all of these longer-term macro things should end up being good for Bitcoin.
Okay, so their main argument in this whole newsletter is that we're in this rolling recession where like different parts of the global economy are slowing down one after another, and they think that central banks are kind of behind the curve in terms of how they're responding to this.
Right.
They even bring up this guy Michael Howell, who's got this global GDP model that's showing a 300 basis point slowdown since like the end of last year, which is a lot. That's a 3% drop.
Yeah, that's a big drop. And what's really interesting is that even with all these signs that the economy is facing some headwinds, Bitcoin has actually dropped in values quite a bit recently. And the newsletter's take on that is that it's mostly because the whole market is just kind of shaky right now.
Well,
Everything from stocks to bond yields to just the general feeling among investors, everything's volatile.
uh,
So their analysis is all about how to position yourself for the long term while all this crazy short-term stuff is happening.
okay, so let's dig into that negative short-term Z-score a bit more. What are the things that are making them so cautious in the near future?
Well, there are a bunch of factors. They're looking at this AI macro data that seems to be backing up the idea that a global recession is actually already happening.
Right.
Plus, you see investors holding onto a ton of cash, which is usually a sign that they're nervous and not willing to take risks.
Makes sense.
And then you've got those market volatility measures like the MOVE index for bonds and the VIX for stocks. Those are up too. And on top of that, the newsletter points out that the Federal Reserve is being hesitant, and there's some stress in those short-term repo markets. Plus, those tariffs are still having a negative effect on global equities.
Wow. So yeah, a lot of stuff pointing to a rocky road ahead in the short term.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's switch gears to that more optimistic long-term Z-score. What's making them feel so good about the long term?
Well, the main thing is that global liquidity keeps growing, and they actually say that a weaker US dollar is a good thing in this situation.
Uh-huh.
Plus, we're seeing governments in big economies like China and Germany starting to ease up on fiscal policy, which should help.
Okay.
And then another big thing is that long-term US Treasury yields have dropped sharply. They're down to 3%.
Wow.
But maybe the most interesting thing is that Bitcoin has stayed pretty steady even though the stock market has dropped by 6%.
Hmm.
So the newsletter is saying this might be an early sign that Bitcoin is starting to do its own thing separate from traditional markets.
Yeah, that idea of Bitcoin decoupling from equities, that's something I'm really going to be keeping my eye on.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about the rest of the crypto world? What's the newsletter's take on all that?
They're pretty specific about their opinion.
Bitcoin they see as holding firm and even looking strong compared to other assets. But they think Ethereum is weak right now. They say there's no clear reason to invest in it, and it's been doing worse than Bitcoin. And for altcoins as a whole, they say stay away because they could drop a lot in price.
So basically they're saying Bitcoin might be the safest bet in the crypto world for now.
It sounds like it.
Okay, so to sum it all up, this Digital Frontier newsletter is saying that the economy is facing some challenges in the short term with lots of volatility and signs of a recession. But they also think that there's a good chance Bitcoin could recover in the long run because of all that global liquidity and because central banks might start easing up on policy. And that thing about Bitcoin staying steady while the stock market dropped, that's a really interesting sign that things might be changing.
Right. It really seems like they think that potential decoupling is something to pay attention to.
It definitely is. So here's a question for you. With all these different forces at play, the tough economy now versus the potential for things to get better later, What do you think are the big events or things that could happen that would really decide whether Bitcoin follows this newsletter's prediction for the long term or if it gets stuck in all the short-term problems? It's a complicated situation and something to really think about as you make your own decisions in the markets.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to consider.
Yeah, it is.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.